Between 1867 and 1914, about a quarter of the world's landmass was redistributed among 6 European nations. It's pretty astonishing that small countries such as Belgium or Great Britain were able to take over huge tracts of land in Africa and Asia. Today we'll look at this expansion as we cover the new imperialism in today's lecture. Imperialism is a policy of extending a nation's authority by establishing political or economic control over another area or people. Of course, there's different types of imperialism. Direct imperialism when you take over the country, and indirect imperialism when you use your influence to basically dictate how that country is ruled. Now, imperialism in the European sense started at the very beginning at the age of exploration in the 15th century when Portugal and Spain started to expand. So the old imperialism, which we're not talking about today, is directed by those Iberian countries, and their primary focus was on North and South America, and Portugal also had some limited colonies in Africa and limited colonies in Asia. Today, however, we're talking about the new imperialism that happened around 1900. And its major players were more northern European countries, such as France, Great Britain, Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, and Russia. And their focus was not in North and South America. In fact, during the 19th century, these countries broke away from the European rulers, but their main attention was directed towards Africa and Asia. There were 2 non-European countries that played a role. The United States also built an empire during this time period, and Japan started to build a small empire in Asia, the only Asian country that resisted European imperialism. What are some of the reasons for this imperialism? One is national competition. After the nation states were formed due to nationalism, Germany and Italy, some people thought that it would bring a peaceful era, but rather these nations started competing against each other. They thought to be a great power, they would have to have colonies. And if they didn't have a great colonies, they would no longer be a great power, and they'd fall to one of the smaller states in Europe. This ties in with the idea of social Darwinism, that only strong countries that conquer will survive, and weak countries will get conquered by those stronger countries. There's also a sense of racism tied into nationalism, that not only are you proud of your nation and want to be unified, but that you're superior, and it's your job to conquer and educate other individuals. We'll touch on that a little bit more when we hear about the civilizing mission. This is a concept that white people had to go throughout the world and teach other people how to be civilized. It is epitomized by a poem by Rudyard Kipling in response to the Americans in the Philippines, and he entitled it White Man's Burden. That he says that to take up white man's burden, to send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile to serve your captive needs. That is, you have to send your sons out to these colonies and teach them not to be devils or children, but to be educated and sophisticated. There's also people that were motivated to go to these colonies to bring their religion. So missionaries played a role. They weren't interested in formal empire or direct empire, but they were interested in more cultural imperialism, that is spreading their ideas and their beliefs to other people outside of their realm. The most important aspect is the economic reasons for empire. Informal empire is kind of similar to what the United States might have today, is that we have a sphere of influence over other countries. So you're not directly taking over their political structure, but through your very strong economy and through trade, you're able to have a sphere of influence, and particularly an economic sphere of influence. And what do they want from these colonies? They want raw materials. They might want rubber from the Congo. They want oil, perhaps from the Middle East, precious metals from South America. And they want to bring these raw materials back to the mother country. There's also an idea that you could make a lot of money through investment. So bankers would invest monies in countries, They'd give them loans, they'd finance infrastructure projects, and if anything went wrong, the country would invade to make sure those properties and those debts were paid. So some have argued a small group of gentlemen capitalists drove imperialism by spreading their money first into these countries, and then later the military came in to make sure that that money was not lost. So you see that there is nationalistic, there's cultural / religious, and there's also economic reasons for imperialism. But how did it happen? Well, they needed certain tools. First of all, they needed quick transportation. You wouldn't have this level of imperialism without new inventions, like the steamboat, which shortened time between the colony and the mother country. Once they established control of it, they would move from the coast and the rivers to the interior using railroads. So without the steam engine, it wouldn't have been really practical. They also built the Suez Canal in Egypt and the Panama Canal in Central America to cut shipping times and make it more practical to travel to various areas. They had military innovations. For example, automatic rifles. Pictured here is the Battle of Omdurman. And in this battle, which the English are moving south to Sudan, about 11,000 Sudanese died and only 28 English died. And it shows you when you have 11,000 not dying on one side and 28 on the other side, it's not a battle, it's a slaughter. That the Europeans had artillery, had guns, and better military training that the native population didn't really stand a chance if they chose to do battle directly. Moreover, the Europeans used locals through cooperation, local militias. For example, in India, they used the sepoys. In Congo, they used the Force Publique, the native branch. So often they'd pay natives to fight in their army or give them certain benefits. So very few Europeans with advanced technology and transportation cooperation could take over huge swaths of land. Africa was was one of the areas that was conquered during the new imperialism. There was small colonies starting with the first stage of exploration under the Portuguese and Spanish, but they remained mainly on the coast. They're primarily interested in trading manufactured goods with slaves and bringing those slaves to the Americas, and this was part of the famous triangle trade. But for the most part, Africa was largely independent. If you look at the map of colonial holdings in 1878, you'll see that Europeans only had colonies on the coast. But by 1914, the entire continent has been conquered, and this is pretty astonishing. And we know this in history as a scramble for Africa. So let's look at the different regions of Africa. One of the oldest colonies are the northern colonies. France first made its way to Algeria in 1830, and from that northern colony, they expanded to the south and hoped to have control over all of North Africa. British did not allow them. They moved into Egypt, and this is part of financial imperialism. Of course, the Suez Canal was a very critical element, and so they move in 1882 in a military expedition to control the Suez Canal and the eastern part of Africa. And from there, they moved down south into Sudan, which we talked about of Omdurman. And the idea of the British is to have a colony all the way from Cairo in Egypt all the way to the Cape in South Africa. So they called it the Cairo to Cape plan. In West Africa, the old colonies were slave trading settlements, and they belonged to the Portuguese and to the British. And from these, particularly the British, started expanding to the interior. But new individuals started making their way, most famously tiny little Belgium under Leopold II set up a private company to take over the entire Congo River basin. He pretended to be a humanitarian, and he names his organization after exploration and civilization of Central Africa, but he makes millions and millions of dollars on rubber. Unfortunately, it's estimated that up to 10 million Congolese died in his empire. They were forced to harvest rubber, and they were compensated very poorly. If they didn't meet their quotas, their hands were chopped off, and that became a symbol of the atrocities that the Europeans committed in Africa. The Germans also move in, seeking colonies on the west coast of Africa, and this led to a real scramble. So they called a conference in Berlin in 1885, and this was to set rules. It recognized Belgium's control of Congo. They also promised to civilize the Africans and end slavery, but it was really a cover to kind of institutionalize the scramble and lay the ground rules. And so they came up with a plan to divide Africa, and that had to be done with soldiers on the ground. You couldn't just start claiming territory, and so it kind of provided some order to this divvying up of the continent. Then there was East Africa. There wasn't really any economic reason to conquer East Africa. It merely became a competition, just to take it so somebody else couldn't have it. The French moved, of course, into Madagascar. The Germans rush in. The English rush in because it's their plan to control all of East Africa. It was no value economically, but it was just fear that somebody else would get it. The Italians were late to the game, and they wanted to establish an empire, and they attacked Ethiopia. And this is the one example, the only example, where the Africans were able to resist. King Menelik II was able to defeat the Italians, and he built up an alliance with the European nations, and he provided a successful model of how to resist European imperialism. South Africa is a little bit different. The British controlled the Cape Colony, and to the north were Boers, or the Dutch settlers, and there was a Boer War, the Anglo-Dutch War, which was fought between the British, who wanted to expand, and they were under Cecil Rhodes, who was interested in, of course, diamond mines, and it was a very difficult war, fought between 1899 and 1903, very expensive, high human costs, but afterwards the Boers were incorporated into the British Empire, and you have a very large British Empire in South Africa. At that point, all of Africa was conquered, except Liberia, which was a colony set up by the Americans for slaves returning back to Africa, and Ethiopia, which defeated Italy. So the Europeans also turned their attention to Asia as well as Africa. Now, Asia was the original interest of European explorers. That is, the Spanish, the Portuguese all wanted to get Asia to their markets, and for their highly priced goods, that was the reason why they left. But even after several centuries of European imperialism, for the most part, Asia was largely independent. That did not continue throughout the course of the 19th, and particularly the end of the 19th and early part of the 20th century. So the English built the largest empire in Asia. It was centered in India, countries today such as Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, Nepal, that region. Interestingly, it was founded not by so much the government, but by a corporation, the East India Company, which had a monopoly of trade for this area. And they started to expand. It was the largest, most populous, most valuable colony for the British. It was the jewel in their crown. They were interested in trade, textiles, but also raw materials later. They would grow opium to trade to England. They'd grow cotton to bring back to their plants in England. They expanded from the coast regions into the interior, and through a system of conquered land and alliances with local rulers, they were able to control all of the subcontinent of South Asia. Of course, there was resistance to European rule. There was one mutiny, that is the Sepoys, who fought for the British, revolted in 1857, 1858, and it was spurred on by the fact that their cartridges were supposedly lined with animal fat, pig and cow fat, which was taboo for the British Sepoys. Well, they were Indian and Muslims, so those fighting for the British, whoever those religions was consuming that fat, was against their religion. They revolted, and it was crushed brutally. There was atrocities on both sides, both by the Indian Sepoys and then later by the British, who were seeking revenge. And we see here the Sepoys attached to cannons, and of course they're going to be blown to pieces as the other Sepoys watched. And they show you what happens when you revolt against the British. That was the only armed revolution that failed. And then they started a little later the Indian National Congress, which was a political attempt to form independence. And Congress is actually going to be the mechanism when Gandhi comes around in the 20th century, where they are going to win their independence through political means, not through armed rebellion. Russia also expanded. Russia is historically a European power, but they started moving further and further into the east. So they move into Siberia, they move into Alaska, which they end up selling in 1867 to the United States. They start moving south into the area of the Ottoman Empire, near the Black Sea. And of course, they bump into the British, who are in India and moving north. And this is called the Great Game between the British and the Russians. They battle for this territory. It's interesting that people's lives are at stake, but they called it the Great Game. They move further south into the also on the eastern end towards Japan, and they actually bump into Japan along the Korean Peninsula, and they fight a war in 1905, and Japan defeats Russia, the first time an Asian power defeats a European power in the modern period. Now, China was not a colony, but it was a case of informal empire or indirect empire, when they basically take over the country for all intents and purposes, but they allow the Chinese to rule themselves. Now, everybody wanted to get to China because it's the largest market and has all these valuable goods, and at the same time, the power of the Chinese Qing Empire is declining. Now, the Chinese didn't want any European products, but the Europeans figured out that the Chinese did want opium. And even if the government tried to stop it, they would smuggle it in. So they started growing opium, and particularly in India, and then smuggling it and bringing it in to China. When the government tries to crack down on it and destroy the European storage sheds for opium, there's a retaliation by the British, and they launched the Opium War, the first of actually 2 Opium Wars. The British Navy is vastly superior to the Chinese. They're able to destroy their fleet, attack the different harbors, and eventually the Chinese have to settle for peace. In the treaty that ends the first Opium War, the Treaty of Nanking, the English get Hong Kong, they get trading rights, they open up numerous ports, other countries rush in, another Opium War is fought, and China has opened its doors to the Japanese, the Russians, the Americans, the French, the Germans. All of them carve out a little sphere of influence in China. So China in many ways is divvied up by the different European powers, and also the Americans and the Japanese as well. There's a series of native responses in China. One is the Taiping Revolution, where an individual believes he is the Jesus' brother, and he launches a revolution against the government. So it's a mix of Western ideas, but also against the Chinese government. And up to 30 million people die in this revolution, and it weakens the Chinese government. More direct anti-Western rebellion is the Boxer Rebellion. And it was a society that believed in traditional beliefs, called themselves the Society of Harmonious Fists. It sounds like a pretty cool group in terms of its name in martial arts. But they were very much against foreigners. And it turns bloody, and of course that is problematic. They attack missionaries, businessmen, diplomats, and eventually Europeans and foreigners form an army to attack the Boxers and hunt them down and kill them. And at that point, pretty much China is lost control over its own country. Now, Japan is an interesting case. The Americans try to open up Japan using gunboat diplomacy, basically saying either open up, there's Commodore Matthew Perry, or we'll blow you up, and eventually Japan does. But Japan realizes very quickly they need to westernize. So they get rid of the shogun and the samurai, the old medieval system of feudalism. They restore the Emperor Meiji, so it's Meiji Restoration. And they form a Western-style army. They adopt Western clothes. They adopt Western industrialization. So they bring advisors in from Britain and from Germany and from the United States. And it's successful. This new modern army and fleet defeat the Japanese, for example, in 1905, and they become an imperial power. Of course, it doesn't play well, as we'll see with World War II, that this new sense of nationalism and militarism ends up in becoming very aggressive. Now, the United States also builds an empire. We forget about that. We buy Alaska from the Russians. We annex Hawaii. We acquire numerous Pacific islands. We also seize territory from Spain when we fight the Spanish-American War over tension in Cuba. After we defeat the Spanish, we annex Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. So the United States also builds a pretty substantial empire by the turn of the century. So we see the new imperialism, these American, Japanese, but mainly European countries, for a variety of reasons, competition, economic, cultural, seizing all of this new territory. And really, by the eve of World War I, all of Africa, with the exception of Ethiopia and Liberia, and pretty much all of Asia, are conquered, with the exception again of with Japan, are conquered by these foreign powers. So next time, we'll look at how European society changes internally when we look at mass society in the 19th and early 20th century.